The resurrection of Jesus Christ is the most attacked doctrine in Christianity. If the skeptics can dismantle the resurrection, the entire Christian faith would collapse. And that's why they fight so hard to disprove it. So if there's no resurrection, there's really no Christianity. But here's the problem for the skeptics. The resurrection, it's a fact. It happened. And the evidence is overwhelming. So we see churches, they're full on Easter morning. People dress up and show up to hear the same sermon year after year. But a lot of them don't really understand what the resurrection is. We use the word, we sing about it, and if someone asks you to defend the resurrection or even to define it, what it means, can you do that? In this first lesson, we're going to define the resurrection the way the Bible does. And we're going to see that belief in the resurrection didn't begin with Jesus, but it's woven throughout Scripture. There in the Greek, there in the New Testament, the word resurrection just basically means rise from the dead, to awaken, or to make one stand up. It's not complicated or metaphorical. It's literal. Someone who was dead is now alive. Now, resurrection isn't only a New Testament event. There were actually some resurrections in the Old Testament. The first one, 1 Kings 17, the prophet Elijah resurrected the widow's son in Zarephath. The boy died and Elijah prayed and God brought him back to life. The second one is in 2 Kings 4. Elisha raised the Shunammite son. Same thing, a dead boy, prayer, then he was resurrected. Third was in 2 Kings 13, when a dead body was thrown on Elisha's grave. When the dead body touched Elisha's bones, the man came back to life. So that's demonstrating God's power over death there in the Old Testament. And there were several resurrections in the New Testament as well. Jairus' daughter in Mark 8, the widow's son at Nain in Luke 7, and then, of course, the most well-known, besides Jesus, would be Lazarus, there in John 11. When Jesus heard that Lazarus was sick, he waited 2 days before heading to Bethany. By that time, Jesus arrived, Lazarus has already been in the grave for 4 days. And the belief was that the spirit would linger above the grave for 3 days to see if the body was really dead. And by day 4, the spirit would see that the body is stinking and starting to decompose, and then the spirit would depart. So Jesus waited until day 4 because he didn't come to heal a sick man. He came to raise the dead. So when we talk about resurrection, we're not talking about something brand new here in the New Testament. We're talking about something God has been doing all along. And so, most accepted that God could resurrect the dead. There was a group there in the New Testament called the Sadducees. They were sad, you see, because they rejected the resurrection. And there in Matthew 22, the Sadducees confronted Jesus. They set up a straw man for them to tear down so they could prove that there was no resurrection. But, Jesus used the law that supposedly they studied and believed, and he ends up quoting Exodus 3:6, and, where it says, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. He is the God of the living, not the dead. And think about, what's being said there, and Jesus used that there in Matthew 22. So when God spoke to Moses at the burning bush, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they've been dead for centuries. But God didn't say, I was their God. He says, I am their God. This is present tense because they're still alive. So death isn't the end. God is the God of the living. And, death doesn't really end a covenant relationship. God is the God of the living. And then, his people, they live even after death. And that's really what resurrection is. And that's why the Sadducees hated it, because if the resurrection was real, then this life isn't all there is. There's a judgment coming. There's eternity. And they didn't want to face that. But, what it means for you is, if you've trusted Christ's finished work on the cross for salvation, death is not the end for you either. You'll be resurrected. You'll live forever. Not as a ghost or spirit floating around, but, as a physical resurrected person with a real body who lives eternally with God. And really the opposite of that, the terrifying part, is if you reject him, you will not have that new body. You'll enter eternity with your existing body that fades and feels pain. Really, that's a true hell right there. So in the next lesson, we'll move from, definition of understanding what resurrection is to what did resurrection accomplish. So, be sure to subscribe, and, also have a study guide available if that's something that interests you. So, thanks for watching.